recipient, around 70 billion, and that is far larger than the FDI inflows. So, I think these are views that have been there for a number of decades in terms of potential impacts and the benefits of migration, both for sending and receiving countries. So I thought, in that context, it's worth reflecting on, what has actually changed. And clearly, it's a lot around the politics and the discourse that happens around these issues. But you see in these receiving countries, particularly, US, UK, that as Professor Rajan has focused on, there's a large proportion of the population who feel that they've missed out on prosperity, or they've lost a prosperity that was taken for granted, or their parents' generation had. And my brother-in-law in the UK, he lives in Oxford, and he explained to me why he supported UQIP. And it was really because he saw that his kids were never going to be able to afford a house in Oxford. Median house price around £700,000 in Oxford. And that's out of the reach of the average worker. But is that due to migration? Well, that's the real issue, right? So they have linked a lot of issues. There's, trade, technology, etc. And, investment flows that come in that push, those markets. But you see the turmoil continues, political turmoil, as we speak. The UK elections are panning out to be another disruption, another uncertainty around these sort of policies. Yes, we've had mass movements of refugees, the Syrian refugees making their way to the EU, and now mostly getting stuck in Turkey. Now, these are massive numbers of people, but this is also not new. We've had many movements of refugees in the past, and Europe and Germany have experienced a number of those waves of new migrants coming in large numbers. And really, it's the southern countries, developing countries, which continue to bear the brunt of those refugee flows. I mean, Pakistan, Lebanon, and the Syrians, and Turkey, with around 2 million Syrian refugees. But beyond these issues, it is worth noting that, of course, trends continue and trends change and trends accelerate. And, on the demographics, the deceleration of population growth, the decreasing share of the working age population continue to act as a big factor in driving in workers, as with the labor shortages you see in countries, also the rise in demand for workers in the care economy. And if you go to any retirement home or old people's home, my country in Australia or any advanced economy, it's largely staffed by migrant workers. But the demographic transition has been in process for a long time, but now we've also got added complexities because emerging economies have started and accelerated. China, Brazil, parts of Southeast Asia. Even in India, though, on average, there's some years to go. You see in the south, of course, Professor Rajan knows very well that populations are aging and aging quite rapidly, and that whole demographic transition for the South India, Sri Lanka, others are going to be far shorter than was witnessed in advanced economies. A big issue, and of course, I'm from the ILO, so I have to mention issues of working conditions. And I think it's important to then reflect, have working conditions for migrant workers deteriorated? Have they changed? I think, partly we know much more about working conditions of migrant workers than in the past, particularly in the Gulf, etc. But it is worth noting in this context, the rise of global supply chains, of course, has created a further fragmentation of work, and migrant workers are moving around the world and within countries as well to take up those jobs. And within those global supply chains, there are inherent challenges in terms of, enforcing labor laws and ensuring working conditions. As pointed out by Professor Rajan as well, a big factor is also the state of the global economy. We see continuing uncertainty in Europe. That's unlikely with the election today in the UK. It's only likely to continue. You've seen the impact on the Gulf in terms of the oil and gas prices, commodity prices in general. So there is uncertainty around the demand for migrant workers, but at the same time, the push for migrant workers remains, right? So the push for migrant workers who are trying to get higher wages and better conditions elsewhere continues. So I think this does raise many issues. And then thinking into the future, and we're talking a lot these days about the future of work. ILO as well, we have a Future of Work initiative leading up to our centenary anniversary in 2019. And if you think about the future of work and the drivers of the future of work, which really to me is what we're seeing today, but considering likely changes, they are very relevant for migration. So demographics is there, climate change, as Rajat had mentioned, technology. So if you're going to have technology which also has a similar impact on workers depending on whether you're going to be a substitute or a complement. That is going to add, adding pressure on particularly the low-skilled workers in destination countries. And you've had, as you, I think, many of you are familiar with this whole discussion about the polarization of jobs, and David Otto has talked a lot about this and others in the US, where you've had a lot of the middle, the shrinking share of those occupations in the middle. If you look at the skill distribution, the rise of the professionals and the rise of the low-skilled service sector workers. So, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the low end of that distribution if technologies can continue to have that type of impact. Though technology is not the only factor, but really it's something to watch very carefully. So just in the last few minutes, let me say something about, well, what needs to be done? The G20 is there, yes, and G20 does provide a forum. I'll come back to that. At the ILO, we recognize both, the opportunities and challenges posed by migration. It's an important mechanism for people to find employment, earn higher wages, reduce poverty. Women's economic empowerment can be promoted, but at the same time, women are also very vulnerable to exploitation. But there are some key deficits that need to be highlighted that do require policy interventions, dialogue, and cooperation. You've got abusive, fraudulent recruitment practices, violations of migrant workers' rights, skills issues, recognition of skills, lack of transferability of skills, lack of social protection and portability. And these are very important areas that need to continue to be addressed at the global, regional, bilateral, and country level. At ILO, we have a number of conventions, international labor standards that are relevant in these areas. But, I have to also say that in the past, programmatically we hadn't worked enough on migration, but in the last 3-4 years we've increased our focus. In 2014, we launched a global multi-stakeholder fair recruitment initiative, and that's particularly around the recruitment practices to reduce the cost of migration, as mentioned, is a big issue, protect the migrant workers and reduce their vulnerability to human trafficking and exploitation. And that continues to be a big issue. There are now guidelines on that. There are projects in India. We have a Work in Freedom project, which is an interregional project, a DFED-funded one, looking at these issues. And as we speak, we have our International Labour Conference in Geneva, and one of the topics of discussion is labour migration. It is very much on the agenda. As it has been in the G20, we heard about the Turkish presidency, and they had requested, because of that influx of Syrian refugees, they became immediately an issue for the Turkish presidency. In 2015, ILO together with the OECD World Bank got together and prepared a joint paper on the contribution of labour mobility to economic growth. Ministerial declaration recognized that. So when they said in their ministerial declaration, when managed carefully and effectively and in a fair manner, international labour mobility has the potential to make an important contribution to economic growth. Now, there are also other global platforms. A global compact on migration, which is due to be adopted next year, is one. It's linked also the SDG agenda, target 10.7. But really, the challenge is how do you, in implementation, getting over the politics to actually look at concrete responses. Regionally, there are perhaps more potential for concrete responses. You have the Abu Dhabi dialogue, you have the Colombo process. ASEAN has been very good at, skill recognition. They've got a common skill qualification framework. Of course, SARC is, a long way off. SARC did put migration, and we had also been lobbying hard with SARC on their agenda in 2014. Very weak sort of look at it, but then, it was an important step. It remains, remains a lot to be done in terms of getting it onto the SARC agenda. You have also bilateral labor agreements, which have become migrant and labor agreements that have become more common. Even the Indian government has been pushing on bilateral social security agreements. They've been doing this in the BRICS forum. BRICS is emerging as quite a strong platform as well. And ILO has also been supporting those BRICS discussions, and one of the key steps they've made is on bilateral social security agreements, so the recognition of social security agreements in other countries. At the country level, there's a lot that needs to be done, and I'll probably run out of time, but policies need to be looked at in terms of enhancing contribution of migrants, responding to demographic skill shortages. But the integration of migrant workers in destination countries is very important, and particularly refugees. And refugees do have a harder time at integrating the labour market. That's also the evidence, and it is important to tailor policies. Of course, you have the normal plethora of active labour market policies that are used, but at the same time, you've got the impact on the natives, as we call them, in terms of their displacement. So those remain highly relevant, and you know, when we look at the interaction with technology and other drivers of the future of work, these continue to be very relevant. The costs need to be reduced, and you know, in 2014, G20 leaders did reiterate their commitment and you know, around remittance costs to try to reduce it to 5% and even further. And this is something we also work on, also within the context of projects, and you know, how to reduce migration costs and also remittance costs. So just finally, I think dialogue is crucial. Dialogue is happening. It is a big issue politically, so it is getting onto the G20. It is getting into you know, BRICS. It's getting into other platforms. You know, but really the real challenge is the implementation, you know, and particularly the implementation of collective responses. We know the challenges around there. But I think though data has improved, we continue to have major gaps in data. And, you know, when we have a lot of fake news, and you know, around, and a lot of political discourse around these issues, is absolutely critical. We have more research. It's a very dynamic issue, very dynamic trend. We need more research in this rapidly changing economic and political landscape. And I think this, you know, is important for all of us to continue to look at and ensure that we have our facts about the benefits and the challenges on migration and how to enhance the first and reduce the latter. So thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Chair, for that comprehensive presentation. Couldn't agree with you more on the need for more evidence and more data, especially at a time when it's so easy to lay the blame on the doorstep of migration and labor mobility when things are not going so well for a country, as Professor Rajan also said. So when you're in bad times, it's easy to blame. Either in the previous session, we saw that it was easy to blame trade, and what you're saying is it's easy to blame migration, especially when things are not going so well. And when these voices come from people as respected as Paul Samuelson, you know, he wrote a paper, he co-authored a paper in the 90s in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, and I'm sure many of you would have seen that, where he coined the term Bangalore, where the problems in the US market on employment were laid at the doorstep of migrant workers from India, especially from Bangalore. And thus Bangalore became a term which became, you know, jargon in labor and trade literature, and it continues to be, as somebody I think used it this morning as well. Okay, our last talk is by Axel Berger, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this panel. And also want to congratulate you to putting this issue into the program, because from my perspective, this is a very important issue in light of the populist challenge we are dealing with. You're very right that we are not only have to talk about trade, about protectionism, about the effects of technology, but also the other aspects related to migration, to security. So it's very important to talk about this issue here at this conference. As we had already two very good presentations about the issue of migration as such, I would like to tackle the issue from the perspective of the G20. So here are the three aspects I would like to talk about. So first of all, I mean, I still remember, you may also remember the very passionate speech we heard yesterday morning about what should be on the agenda and what should not be on the agenda. So I would like to discuss a little bit about why should the G20 deal with migration, with forced migration in particular. Then secondly, I would like to present some of the ideas which have been produced in the T20 process this year, in particular by the task force. We had a dedicated task force on forced migration, so I would like to present some of the ideas the colleagues came up with. And then thirdly, would like to speculate a little bit about what we can realistically expect from the Hamburg Summit. So why should the G20 deal with migration at all? Obviously, we have a discussion on, as I said, what should be on the agenda of the G20 and what should not be on the agenda. So what's the rationale for the G20 to tackle the migration issue? First of all, the G20 on the leaders level has to tackle nexus issues. So issues that relate to economic as well as political issues, economic as well as social issues. And migration is such an issue, which came up in the previous two presentations quite clearly. And global leaders have to respond to global crises. And obviously, we have a global migration crisis. Many migrants are there in many G20 countries. So there is an issue to be dealt with. Secondly, in order to make the G20 relevant for the leaders, it should give leaders a forum to respond to domestic concerns as well. And in many countries, as we heard, migration is a concern. So there's another rationale why leaders should deal with the migration issue. And another argument why the G20 should deal with the issue is that we have an insufficient global migration architecture. We have several institutions, but there are many deficiencies with regard to the overall architecture. So there can be made an argument that the G20 should make efforts to strengthen this global architecture. But, of course, tackling the migration issue, the G20 also faces some challenges. First of all, migration means different things to different people. So some talk about illegal labor migration. Others talk about refugees and asylum seekers. And then there is this more or less new discussion about climate refugees. So we are talking about many different aspects. So G20 should be very clear of what kind of process it is dealing with. G20 represents the perspective mainly of destination countries. It's not, so there's a need to involve source countries as well in the discussions. And obviously, and this is true for many policy areas, the G20 must ensure that it does not duplicate existing efforts, obviously within the UN system, but then there's also a global forum on migration. So the role of the G20 should be to strengthen and support these ongoing efforts. Okay, what are the policy proposals on forced migration that came up from the T20 process? So I talked about the T20 process yesterday, so I do not have to go into the details here, but just to mention that there was a dedicated task force on migration, which brought together many migration experts from think tanks, from universities, in a task force. They met several times, and they came up with a couple of policy briefs, so short documents which we sent to the policymakers. And here are some ideas from these policy briefs. First of all, there's the suggestion that the G20 should promote the integration of forced migrants into national labor markets, right, through the creation of special economic zones and work visas. In particular, the task force said there's a need to mobilize the private sector to develop sustainable solutions for the global refugee crisis. The task force suggested to establish made by refugees special economic zones in the refugee hosting countries. Further proposals by these colleagues They were coming from Turkey. Promote refugee entrepreneurship through fast-track work visas, entrepreneur visas, and special startup visa programs. For further details, obviously, please have a look at the policy brief authored by the colleagues from TEPAF, a Turkish think tank. Second set of proposals. There's a need to have a transition from the humanitarian aid to more sustainable, a more sustainable development, and in particular with regard to education and education infrastructure. So the task force suggested that there is a need for meetings of education ministers focusing on educational services for refugees. Furthermore, international organizations and national governments should be encouraged to provide ways to recognize prior teaching qualifications of refugees so that they can act as teachers. And then enhance international efforts to develop accredited non-formal education, providing accelerated learning opportunities for youth who are not eligible for formal schooling. Third set of proposals, there's a need to support low and middle income countries that host refugees. As I said, G20 mainly represents the perspective from destination countries, but obviously there's a huge need to also support non-G20 countries that hosting refugees. So there's, first of all, a need to find out what works and what does not work, which interventions work and which do not work. So G20 should initiate broader efforts by multilateral, bilateral donors to really identify best practices for policy interventions. Secondly, engage jointly with the donor community, host countries in a partnership for refugees that involves firm and predictable commitments for assistance to host countries over the medium and long term to match efforts by host countries to facilitate the formal social and economic inclusion of refugees. Again, have a look at the policy briefs to read more details. And then fourthly, there's a need to deal with the issue of climate migrants or climate refugees. So first of all, the task force suggested that relevant international organizations jointly produce and submit annual reports to the G20 on the dynamics of global environmental change and temporary, protracted, permanent displacement of people. So to have a better knowledge base when we talk about climate migrants, climate refugees. And then also to promote long-term efforts to help climate migrants, climate refugees to make new homes and integrate into the communities of their locality, region, or country of destination. Okay, these were some of the proposals which we, as think tanks, proposed to the G20. Let's see what is being picked up. So last question of my presentation is, what can we realistically expect from the Hamburg summit? First of all, Germany, as Turkey, put the migration challenge, migration issue rather high on the agenda. Here are some lines from the priorities document that the German G20 presidency presented at the beginning of its chairmanship. So first of all, the German chair acknowledged that there is a huge crisis. The world is currently experiencing one of the largest refugee flows since the Second World War. This requires internationally coordinated answers. And it goes on to suggest that it's necessary to elaborate suggestions on how international cooperation can be improved. So that's about the global migration architecture. And the aim is to strengthen international institutions and structures in order to better address displacement and illegal migration. So these are the priorities of the German government when it comes to the G20 in 2017. Obviously, it's difficult to predict what will happen in Hamburg in less than a month's time, but we had the G7 summit in Taormina, Italy, Sicily, so we can draw some lessons from these negotiations. First of all, the Italian host drew attention to the refugee crisis happening right at the doorstep of Sicily in the Mediterranean Sea. And the initial plan of the Italian G7 chair was to draft a standalone document called G7 Vision on Human Mobility. So very ambitious agenda for the G7 summit. And the focus of this initiative was to opening up safe and legal channels for migrants and food security issues as well. But the US, but also Britain and Japan was against substantial commitments on this front with regard to safe and legal channels for migration. And if we have a look at the communique of the G7 summit, we can conclude that the prospects on migration for the Hamburg summit, for the Hamburg G20 summit, are rather bleak. So let's. That's my last slide. Let's have a look at the outcome of the G7 summit, which can gives us some indications what will happen in Hamburg. So first of all, there was a strong emphasis on the sovereign rights of states to control their borders and to establish policies in their own national interests and national security. So that's a very different language compared to what the Italian G7 chair intended. And what is left from the bold proposal of the G7 chair is the last sentence. In this manner, we will safeguard the value of the positive aspects of safe, orderly, and regular migration, since properly managed flows can bring economic and social benefits to countries of both origin as destination, as well as to migrants and refugees themselves. So that's a very vague sentence. It's we had this kind of language already more or less in the Antalya G20 communique. So again, I think this gives us some indication of where the G20 summit is headed on the migration issue. But of course, maybe we will be surprised by the countries like US and Britain with more or less erratic leaders, but let's see. But all in all, I think the Hamburg summit will not produce any substantial results on migration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Axel. You rely on the UK and US for hope. Well, I mean, before I open the floor for all questions from the audience, let me just kind of relate an anecdote, not an anecdote, something that I saw in one of my visits to Europe, which is heartening, of course, in that it attempts to integrate refugees into the mainstream workforce in a place called Flanders in Belgium. And they have this company called Krungwinkel, which basically recycle, reuse, and repair. And most of the workers that are employed in Krungwinkel are refugee workers, and they are targeted refugee workers. It's low-skilled jobs, but they're trained. I mean, they're trained for repairing old electronic items, discarded DVDs and washing machines, and so they're trained and re-employed. And the good thing is that they also are then sold these refurbished machines and appliances, then sold into the market, and through which they're being able to secure the revenue to pay these workers. But also the government actively encourages refugees to be employed by giving a subsidy. I don't know exactly how much that subsidy is, but it's close to about 50% off. So I mean, of course, Flanders is a small region of a very small country, and the magnitude of the problem is not very high. But I did want to end this on a slightly optimistic note. So the floor is open for questions. So we have about 15 minutes, or maybe 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Yes.
So I'm Ratna Sahai from the IMF. I'm not an expert, but I really enjoyed listening to each of the speakers. I learned a lot. But the problem of immigration, I live every day these days, it seems, in the US. So one issue that to me seems to be really one that any new work or research should focus on is the question of why do some integrate better than others? And that relates to which home country, which host country, what were their levels of education, what was the education they acquired, what jobs did they get into, and very importantly, also, is it the first generation, is it the second generation? Because typically the first generation is simply very grateful to have had the opportunity to work and do well. That's what we see in the US at least. And then, of course, comes the question of what policies for integration. I know it's a more longer term issue, but to me, fundamentally, the resistance and the populist movements have come from, isolated incidences, and maybe they're not so isolated anymore, of extreme crime, which may not reflect how whole societies are. But what is concerning is the ghettoization that you see in many advanced countries. And I feel that unless you address that issue, apart from finding jobs, etc., but social integration is absolutely key.
We'll collect questions. So there's a gentleman there.
Thank you. My name is Sebastian Zwoder. I work for the Austrian commercial section for the embassy. And my question is actually targeted to Dr. Berger. I would just be interested, maybe you can give us a brief overview how you see the chances of integration of the refugees that came to Germany throughout the last 2-3 years, especially also as a follow-up question to the one that we just had. If you think about that most of the people come from the Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan region, like what is the likelihood for integration? Do you see like a good outlook that people can get integrated? Maybe you can also tell us a bit about the education background and what maybe needs to be done from the German government or European governments to integrate refugees.
You had a question, and then we'll do a second round. We'll take 3 questions, and then I'll do a second round.
Vinayshil Gautam, Senior Managing Director and Principal Economic Advisor of a global consulting company and Chairman in International DK Foundation. I would like to spin 3 perspectives into a very rich conversation and urge us to recognize that the question of migration cannot be made distinct from the proposition of technological relationships. The inhabitation of the Wild West was the story of a single gun traveling across the West. And migration did not begin with the Second World War. Migration is as old as the rivers. I don't want to get into that, but if you study the native communities of Canada or Australia, we find policy statements one after another apologizing for having taken away the land and now protesting against the wrongs and seeking forgiveness and seeking permission. The story is endless. So my second submission, the first was to incorporate the technological perspective a little more intensively. My second proposition is the time frames have to be understood because the previous problems of migration have not gone away. My third submission is there are several stakeholders today in the study of migration, and I'm so grateful that a person like Professor Rajat Kathuria is leading this upfront from ICRIER. FICCI is onto it. All sorts of organizations are onto it. I don't want to list it. Even IGNO is onto it. I was chairing an international panel on migration only 2 months ago there. There seems to be a repetition of data because the sources are the same. There seems to be a repetition of issues because the issues have not been resolved. It would be helpful, Dr. Kathuria, if under your leadership you could create a bucket of solutions. And I'm looking forward to listening to you when you propose your suggestions on taking it forward. How can we have an intensive perspective rather than what would appear a data-driven situation which is neither illuminating nor instructive? I'd like to stop there because I have made 3 propositions which I think are useful to the understanding of the proposition. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'll go back to the panelists. The first question, Professor Rajan, maybe,
I think
and Axel.
only one sentence, because when you talk about how some integrate better than others, we did some study on student mobility. We asked the Indians, why do you want to go to, say, a country like UK, though there are problems, or Australia, there were some crises. They said, when we're there, we can speak English. So Germany offers a lot of fellowships, or Netherlands, they are talking about full scholarships. And France started talking, you can write your thesis even not in French, even in English. Still there is some type of thing, language. I think they think that we would like to go to Australia, Canada, UK, something like a language. This is what we hear from the student who wants to move from India to study abroad. Of course, now they are going to Russia and China, of course, the new destination for the students. So this is something they look at as a language where we can go. We can immediately integrate when you get down from the airport in Britain, you can talk to somebody, okay, please take me here. Maybe in Paris, maybe they have difficulties, or in Germany, they have difficulties.
Sure. Would you like to say?
Yeah, well, thank you for those questions. Just from Ratna from IMF on the integration, and it's true, it varies in terms of source countries, but also varies across countries depending on their migration policies to begin with, whether you have skilled migration, etc. But if you look at the policies for integration, they are critical, and I think this is where we also need more knowledge in terms of what makes a difference. I think particularly in terms of refugees, which are going to pose more challenges in terms of integration in countries like Germany. But if you look at beyond refugees, also for skilled workers, recognition of skills is a big area, skill recognition, so that migrant workers can move and have their skills recognized without having to start afresh. And I talked about the ASEAN framework, and there's also bilateral agreements on skills recognition, but this definitely is an area that needs more work. I mentioned that also countries typically use active labor market policies for integration. Europe has got a plethora of different types of policies, but there we also know some work, some don't. It requires continually experimenting on what type of policies will make a difference, but I think the early interventions are the critical ones, particularly for refugees, so that they do get support on languages, on skills, soft skills, how to search for jobs, some type of training, work placement, etc. And these will be very important for those destination countries. Maybe if I just touch on this, Mr. Gautam, from need solutions. I think there are some solutions. I also agree we need more, but I think the challenge is the implementation of those solutions and who's going to be responsible for them. So I think making it clear that a global forum is not going to solve all these issues. It's important to raise the political commitments, but then how do countries take them on? How do they do this bilaterally and also regionally? Is I think where the scope is also to improve on implementation. I'll leave it at that.
Axel?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question about the likelihood of integrating refugees into the German system into the German labor market. Well, as I said, I'm more working on G20 issues, less so on migration. So my answer will be a very limited one. I mean, obviously, the German system, the German government was quite surprised by the huge influx of refugees in starting 2015. So the system, and in particular the administrative capacities, were quite you could say overburdened, but I mean the main deficiencies or the main challenges are to first of all improve the language skills of refugees, because that's the essential skill for them to integrate into the German society, German labor market in particular. Other issues are skills recognition, as was just mentioned here. That's also obviously also the case with regard to Germany, and I think we have to make a huge effort, because it will be a long-term effort. I mean, many of the refugees are coming from Syria, from other countries, from other regions where we have civil wars and such situations. So they will not return to their countries in the short term. Most likely, many of them will stay in Germany. So it will be a long-term effort. Will it be a successful one? I don't know. I mean, many of the refugees have surely a good educational background, a lot of skills they can bring to the German society, to the German labor market. But whether they will be successfully integrated, well, personally, I don't know. I could only guess. And I think we will. It's a huge challenge for Germany, even for Germany, a country as developed as Germany. So the future, yeah, we'll hope the answer, I guess.
Thank you. So we'll do one more quick round. I had seen some hands up. So there are 3, 4, 5. Okay. So we'll please make it brief, because you're standing between us and lunch. Please make your questions brief. We'll do 5 questions. Yes. Gentleman, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Kathuria. My compliment for bringing this issue into such a detailed discussion. And I have very quick question. One is that I worked in CDOT. We set up CDOT and telecom, and presently I work as member of the Finance Minister's Direct Tax Council. See, the issue is, I'm talking about the reverse migration. A lot of things are being talked about migration. I'm looking at the reverse migration. And a lot of people, recently when I was in US, I found there is a distinct dislike for Asians. And especially it is the railway carriage mentality, where the earliest who have come, they don't want the others to come. Now the point is that a lot of people have developed US. They have Indians and Asians have developed tremendous amount of facilities and infrastructure and so on. It is the duty of some of these countries to give us infrastructure so that people can be rehabilitated into India. And we can still contribute with the telecom and the facilities available. But say R&D facilities, CDOT was one example where we brought a lot of people from US and developed telecom. So I think we have to think about it. Under your leadership, we must prepare a paper where it is the responsibility of a lot of developing countries to build up infrastructure, like Bell Labs. I was very keen to set up a lab like Bell Lab in India. I talked to Montec, but nobody was interested. But there are a whole lot of people who really like to come to India and work. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was Mr. Saxena, for everybody's benefit, who used to work with DOT. There was a question back there. Could you please identify yourself?
I am Yogesh Tanbar from NCAR. So my question is that discussion either in favor of or against the migration can be substantiated if we can estimate the contribution of migrants to the respective countries. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. There were 3 more hands I had seen. Yes. Yes, Matthias.
Thank you very much, panelists, for the rich discussion. I'm Matthias from ADBI. Just a question to Axel. We know that health is a very important priority for the German presidency and also for the Japanese G7 presidency. And in the health field, we have a global shortage of healthcare workers. And I was just wondering whether this kind of cross-cutting issue has been addressed. So basically migration of healthcare workers and how to address this shortage of healthcare workers globally. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, my question about migration is regarding recently Portugal Prime Minister was in Delhi. He was making a lecture on migration. He said, my parents are very old. I can't take care of my parents. Only migrant people take care of my parents. Later on, he became the Secretary General of UN. So can we take this issue on the global level, UN level, so that this migration is resolved? It's a global village. It's because this migration happens because of employment. If employment is generated, no migration will be taken the way we are taking. So let us take it as a global village migration type of thing.
And last question for Mr. Nair. Professor Nair.
This was a very illuminating session. First comment. Second, a question, some clarification from Professor Irudharajan. Can we qualitatively compare the data of Indian migrants in Saudi Arabia with that of countries like Australia and Canada, where, you see, you really shift population from India to Canada and Australia. In Gulf countries, you always come back, by and large. Then the other question to Professor Irudharajan is, did you notice substantial wage differences between migrant laborers going to work in these countries and wages paid to local labor? I have a hunch there will be. And I comment to Professor Axel Berger's very illuminating presentation. It's a very serious human problem that the world is facing. And I think a lot of international collaboration and collaboration with even NGOs and individuals will be required. I was wondering whether countries like Australia and New Zealand, which are at times known to be notoriously short of labor, were they associated in these discussions? I would like to be illuminated. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Professor Rajan, most of the questions are directed.
Not all to me.
Not all, most. And I'll go to Axel.
No, I will pick up two.
Pick up whatever you think.
I will pick up two.
We can also engage over lunch. Yeah.
One thing is that I think we always talk about impact of migration on the countries of origin. For example, like my friend from ILO said, no, like impact on migration on poverty decline in Nepal, or impact on migration in Kerala. But we never discussed the migrant do in the countries of destination, which I said a statement told by a Malayali in Dubai. When I came 30 years back, it was only sand. We built this city. And all the buildings, at least there would have been one accident, somebody would have died, most likely East and South Asian. I think that has to be built-in, documented. I think this is something we are not doing our justice to that. I think we don't have much studies on that. I think this is something we should look at it very carefully. And second thing is that when you talk about Gulf, whenever I went for a Abu Dhabi dialogue, I was talking with the Gulf countries. What they were telling, when I tell them migrants, they tell me no, they are not migrant. They are temporary labor. They are telling me, Rajan, they are not migrants. Please remember, they are all coming here on contract. Even we will not allow their dead bodies to be buried in our country. Last 4 years, we received something like around 1,000 dead bodies from 3 airports, Trivandrum, Cochin, Calicut alone, who have died in the Gulf countries. I think this is something they talk about, because they are talking about citizenship. I was told this is what now the Europe is learning about Blue God. See, you want the laborer to, you want to go on recruiting new people, like hire and fire, 2 years, people go. So they don't want like PR, which is talking about the US olden days. Though everybody want to learn Gulf model, which is not a good model because you are sent back. I think this is something we should look at it, the nationality, citizenship issue, which is also very huge in the Gulf countries, because I have seen somebody who worked in the Gulf for 30 years. Still he is just every 3 years he's been renewed. The final point about the wage differential, I think this is a huge topic. I think still we are not able to get correct understanding on that, because even with the experience of in Kerala, what we are finding is that when we talk to the laborer coming from Bihar, many times he says that, sir, I was getting 120 rupees, which is the NREG wages now, and 150 rupees maximum I can get for my work in my state, Bihar or Assam, or in UP or Bihar in a village. Here I get 500, 600 rupees, but actually the wages paid to a Kerala worker is 800, 900 rupees. He tells me, I don't get the Kerala wage, but I get 3 times more than what I get. So I don't mind, because he said, even I don't get in Delhi, sir. A plumber tells me, I don't want to go to Delhi because they'll pay me 200 rupees. So here I don't mind traveling. There are trains coming from Assam, they take 48 hours to come because they don't get Kerala wages, but they don't mind sacrificing because they're getting 4 times more all the 30 days work. Because NREG offers only 100 days of work, we are talking about the 100 days. I think we have to link some policies so that probably something can happen, but the wage difference is a huge issue. We should work on that.
Axel, would you like to go?
Yeah. Well, Matthias, many thanks for your question. Not sure whether the issue of healthcare workers is on the G20 agenda this year. Maybe in the labor track, I'm not quite sure. What are on the agenda are core health issues like communicable diseases, antimicrobial resistance. There was a simulation of a global pandemic simulation of health ministers. There was the issue of better data sharing, but these are core labor issues. But I don't know. Maybe in the labor track, the issue of healthcare workers came up. But it's surely a discussion we have in our domestic setting, a shortage of healthcare workers, and but not sure whether it's really being discussed in the context of the G20. I mean, it's a very complex process. You don't know what is going on all the time in all these different work streams and work tracks. And the second question, I haven't understood it quite. Could you again rephrase your question or ask again? Or did you answer this gentleman here in the second. This one? Yeah. Okay.
Well, just, against or for migration, I think economic evidence tells us migration has a positive impact on growth, but there can be losers, just the same with technology. I mentioned this issue of substitutability, complementarity. But really, it rests on good policies, and some countries have been very proactive at getting skilled migrants and integrating migrants, and I think other countries, and I have to say honestly, I think also, for Germany, I mean, Germany's had a funny relationship with migration and other European countries in terms of, not even having a migration policy, right? I don't want to single out Germany. I live there, and my wife is German, so I'm very fond of the country. But really, frankly, the more open, direct, and immediate the responses are, the better the outcomes will be.
Well, thanks. I think we'll draw the session to a close. The only comment that I could make at the end is that, migration or labor markets is an issue which is becoming, I think, more important on the global agenda, especially as, countries become more inward-looking, not doing as well as they did in the past. And therefore, this subject is going to drive a lot of research, and therefore the evidence will get. So there'll be a demand-driven kind of initiative to try and collect more evidence and collect more data. Just like, in trade became important. There was a focus on trade. Now the quality of trade data across the world, both domestically and internationally, is very, very high, including now very good quality data on global value chain. Similarly with capital flows being in focus, there's good quality data available on capital flows, on migration. And I know that ICRIER itself is working on labor markets in India, job creation in India. Just to kind of make a point about how things become folklore and get repeated. This is this number of, we need to create 1 million jobs a month. And once that number, was put out and repeated by, it had a sort of network effect around it. And everybody started repeating that number. And then when you ask people, what is the basis for that number? Where did that number come from? How does 1 million translate into 10 million or 12 million jobs a year? And there was not so much understanding. So, and we are trying to, ICRIER is actually, even as we speak, we're trying to do a project on how to improve the quality of labor market data, and then use a sort of triangulation approach to look at, estimate the actual number of jobs being produced in the country. But I think this has been a very rich session, and I'm glad we put it on the agenda for two reasons. One, it's, as I said, become important, and as it becomes a part of the global discourse, increasingly, there might be a demand for collecting better quality data, both within countries and across countries. And our quality, Indian quality of data of our workers living abroad is quite patchy, and we need to improve the quality of that data to be able to do the kinds of thing that Mr. Saxena was suggesting that Sam Petroda did for our telecom sector in India. We need to scale that up much more and identify people that can contribute back to India, just like China and Taiwan have done for their IT sectors, and we could do the same for that. But for that, we need some good quality data. But thank you all very much. Let's give the panelists a healthy round of applause. Thank you, Professor Rajan. Thank you, Cher. Thank you, Axel, for a very stimulating discussion. And thank you all for being here. But please don't go away. We need to thank a few other people. But before that, we'll just let the panelists go and sit in the audience. Thank you all very much.
You want a group photo? I didn't know that.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you all for being so patient. I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of you and to thank each one who has made possible this conference. Another, I thought, successful G20 conference, the 9th conference that ICRIER has organized. We started organizing this 9 years ago when we were the secretariat for the G20 in the Ministry of Finance, but subsequently, even when we are not the secretariat, we've been organizing these conferences. And I was saying in my opening remarks yesterday that it's good that we continue to organize this conference, because the papers, the books that we have produced 2 books of these conferences. They have a long shelf life, and some of the papers in those volumes are really, really very stimulating and rich papers, and our researchers continue to refer back to them. And at some point, India will assume the presidency of G20. I don't know whether it will be in 2019. There's no clarity on that yet, but we hope to continue to organize the G20 conferences until at least the Indian presidency. And I made a promise or a commitment yesterday that next year's G20 conference will do a call for papers and hope to produce a volume that could serve perhaps as an input into the G20 process if we assume the presidency in 2019. This year, the conference, as I said, is much earlier. We usually do it in August, September, in cooler times in Delhi. But this year we had to advance it because of the German elections. And the Germans sitting in the audience, and everybody, thank you for being here and also supporting this conference. But I also wanted to use this moment to not only thank all the speakers and our donors, IMF, World Bank, ADBI, and they've been supporting our conference for the last 9 years. And World Bank and IMF and ADBI, and from the World Bank, of course, Junaid and Sebastian was here in the morning. From the ADBI, Matthias is here, Dean Yoshino was here, and from the IMF, Andreas, and of course, Ratna, who spent both days with us and also contributed on the panel yesterday, and Matthias did today. So thankful to all of the institutions for their persistent and consistent support for ICRIER's G20 conference. But this conference would not be possible. Of course, without them it wouldn't be possible, given our funding situation. But it would also not be possible without the effort of our research team and our administrative team. And I want to recognize them and single them out individually. But we have also, if you have the brochure of our conference in front of you, you have all the photographs of the people who have contributed. And if they are sitting in the audience or standing, as I see Kishan, could you all please stand up and be recognized and applauded for your efforts? Shuhaib, Pratik, Ram Chandra Bogati, he did such a good job that he became an attractive target to be poached by ICICI Bank. So he has left us, but he did contribute to the intellectual preparation of the agenda. Niharika, who has worked tirelessly, you can't see her. Can you stand up on the chair? Short in stature, but high on effort. Manmeet, you probably know him. He's our events. Rajkumar, our IT expert, who never lets a virus get into the system. Chaya, is she here? Chaya, you might have seen her outside. Neha is here. Sharad, Neha is there. Sharad, there he is. Kishan and Rajesh. Could you give them one more round of applause, please? And I'll say, before we conclude, I must say that we will organize the conference next year also, and I hope to see all of you there. But I must say a couple of words about what I thought about this conference. I think it's been a fascinating conference. Gets better every year. We're kind of increasing the benchmark of the quality of the conference. I think it was a very good conference. Every year, I think at the inauguration, we raised the question about whether G20 is relevant, whether it was relevant only in wartime, and how relevant it is in peacetime. And those questions will keep coming up. But as Ratna was saying, that it has had some achievement, especially in global financial architecture and creating institutions for better coordination. That has been a success. In terms of its failures and in terms of mission creep, that is bound to happen. But I like what Arvind said in the beginning, that G20 should